My name is David Malone. I have the privilege of working at the United Nations University's headquarters in Tokyo, Japan. And today we have a guest with us, the writer Pankaj Mishra. Pankaj has written about many subjects. He's ranged far and wide, but a common theme in many of them has been Asia, either because the books were set in India or around India, or quite frequently in wider Asia. So this evening he'll be engaging with an audience at UNU on his most recent book, which I have in paperback form, From the Ruins of Empire. And it's a book that ranges across Asia in a generous definition of Asia, because it includes the Middle East. In fact, a lot of it is about the Middle East, and even Egypt. And it actually starts in Japan. So we thought it'd be very stimulating for an audience in Tokyo to hear from him. I'm certainly going to enjoy it. But we wanted to share a little bit of what we'll be talking about with you online. So Pankaj, welcome. Great to have you here, back here, because you were here with your family 2 years ago.
That's right.
And you were researching in Japan earlier for the book, I know. So it's by no means your first visit. Because your entry into the world of literature and your entry into the world of serious research and history was an unusual one, I wanted to ask you a bit about how Pankaj Mishra became Pankaj Mishra, now mainly living in London, occasionally New York, also India. How did it happen?
Long story. But I think it's probably fair to say that I started off as a novelist, or started off wanting to be an imaginative writer. And I started writing when I was very young, living in small towns all across India, where you had plenty of time to daydream and to fantasize and to read. So that was really, I think, in retrospect, quite crucial for me, having that kind of early childhood where there was no pressure. I can't remember any. To either educate yourself properly or to work towards a particular profession, the kind of pressures children now have to deal with. So I was miraculously exempted from all that. And so growing up, it almost came naturally to me, this sort of notion of a life of reading and writing. But it was, again, reading and writing of a particular kind, of mostly fiction, literary fiction. And that's really what I wanted to be and wanted to become when I went up to this little village in Himachal Pradesh in India, and which has been my India base now for more than 20 years. I've done all my writing there. And I think if there was one place where I said I became what I am now, a writer, I think it's that little village.
Great. And I remember reading in one of your books, perhaps An End to Suffering, that when you went to university, you essentially self-educated at the university because you found resources there, literary resources, you hadn't had access to before.
Absolutely. I mean, I had two different university experiences. One was in Allahabad, which is a once very famous and prestigious city, and also the university there, Allahabad University. But by the time I got there, it had decayed really alarmingly. So it was a really hollow shell of itself, and classes were very rarely held, and there were shootouts on the campus. So that sort of sent me back into my life of reading and writing on my own. So I spent about 3 years really doing, basically reading books, not books part of the curriculum, but again, fiction, books of history. And then I did the needful, of course, to pass my examinations. But for 3 years, I just read randomly, whatever I could find in the local libraries, and there wasn't much. But when I got to JNU in Delhi, that was another experience altogether, because it had an incredibly, at least to my eyes, well-equipped library. So I could, really read through entire stacks there. Take out 4 books, and I think I was allowed 4 books out at one time, and take them out, finish them, take them back, and get more. So in that process, again, I think I read literally hundreds of books while I was there, and also doing coursework at the time. But it was really a great privilege to be there and also have access to these other libraries in Delhi. I remember the German embassy's cultural center, Max Mueller Bhavan.
Still going strong.
Still going strong, and they had a wonderful library of German literature and philosophy and English. I did a lot of important reading at that library, in the British Council, of course. And
well, I think you're an advertisement in a way for self-education. It helps to have a framework within to self-educate, but this idea that everything we know is received from a higher authority in a classroom, I think sometimes we're lucky, and it is, but very often it's not. Now, you mentioned creative writing. I think all of your writing is creative, actually, as I read you a lot. But a lot of it is, in fact, nonfiction. Indeed, my favorite book of yours, An End to Suffering, is a very creative weaving together of the life of the Buddha and, in a way, your own life. So there is immense creativity in it, but it could also be considered nonfiction. Likewise, this book is a very creative take on intellectual influences and intellectual trends in the 19th century, leading to a, how can I say, a more self-confident intellectual life in Asia at the beginning of the 20th century. And you say in the book that you have 2 central figures, but that undersells the book, in the sense that all sorts of personalities weave in and out of the book, sometimes around these 2 central characters. And I mentioned the book starts in Japan, so can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I really conceived the book as a series of existential situations, like you would in a novel, where you have particular characters at given times in history who have, again, particular bits of knowledge that helps them navigate their way through their worlds. And I had to imagine myself into their minds. So these are the people, this is what they know, this is what is happening to them at this particular time. And that's how I really trace these particular intellectual journeys, primarily of 2 or maybe 3 people, but there were also these other characters who kept cropping up.
Very interesting characters.
Very, very fascinating people, because as I realized while I was researching this book, that the late 19th century was a time of great intellectual ferment. A lot of travel happened during this period. People left their homes to be educated. They often had to be exiled or had to go into exile because of political persecution in their respective societies. And during their travels, they met various other people like themselves. They came to read very widely, much more widely than they would have had they stayed back in their countries. So this was really a time of very rapid intellectual growth for many of these figures, a time of also great political awakening. But I think my primary focus really was on trying to look at the world, or trying to perceive the world that they saw it, in the way they saw it, and to present that to the reader. And for me, that is what I would call creative nonfiction. Which kind of steps away from more conventional forms of history, that this is not about tracing the history of the nation state or tracing the history of global networks of trade or ideas, but this is actually about particular people, particular characters at particular times.
And in the period you're talking about, either under direct colonial control or indirect colonial strong influence, as was the case of Iran, for example, you had a sort of anti-colonial intellectual movement gaining strength from the writing of others elsewhere in Asia. And your book starts with a particular event in 1905. Why not tell us a bit about that?
Well, which was the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, which I realized, and again, this came as a shock to me, that this was the most crucial event for Asians, speaking very broadly again of Asia, right from Ataturk, who was a soldier in Damascus at this point in 1905, and Gandhi, who was still in South Africa, and Tagore, who had yet to become world famous, but he was pretty, he was by then a pretty distinguished poet. And all of them responded to this event and the fact of Japan's victory over Russia ecstatically. This was to them a demonstration that a humiliated, a trampled upon country like Japan could quickly remake itself into a strong and sovereign nation state and actually become powerful enough to take on a European or maybe a semi-European power, which Russia was at that time, and defeat it militarily. That to all kinds of people was really an extraordinary event. I mean, it was a huge boost to their confidence, because I think if there was one thing that bound all these people together, that brought them together, was this feeling of being humiliated by Western powers, by European powers, and this feeling that we have to regain our sovereignty over our respective societies. And in that sense, Japan was the trailblazing country.
Great. And of course, finally, today, Asia is the focus of a great deal of attention. Asia is rising. And yet, I remember a piece of yours, perhaps a year or two, in the New York Review of Books, drawing on a trip you made probably to Indonesia. It was a fascinating piece about Indonesia and its own internal ferment now. So once again, Asia is on the move, but on the move towards what we're not entirely sure.
Yes, that is the sort of somewhat dark ambiguity now about this so-called rise of Asia. Whether this rise would cause the same kind of conflict and violence that we saw when late-coming European nations like Germany and Italy began to assert themselves in the early 20th century and tried to become powerful nation states, and there was inevitably conflict with the already established powers. I mean, that's obviously history does not repeat itself in quite that way, but I think the rise of Asia really does open up quite, significant. It opens up a scope for conflict within nation states, also between and within nation states. So I think this is not entirely a development to be welcomed. I think it is something to be to actually monitor somewhat suspiciously, because we also know that when we talk about the rise of Asia, we're really talking about the rise of Asian elites.
Yes.
That a vast majority of people in these countries are still very poor. And it's only really a small number of people who are visibly rich, who can travel abroad, who can assert their power internationally and demand seats at various international organizations and institutions. The fact is that the people they represent, most people are still living in poverty, and often without the kind of rights they should be entitled to in democratic societies. So I think there's a lot more to be done before we can speak of the rise of Asia as a positive development for humanity at large.
Certainly the world of Davos man seems rather alien, I'm sure, to most Asians, and it makes Asia so interesting.
It does. And I think even if Davos was physically relocated and in some, say, Himalayan mountain resort, I think it would still feel very disconnected from how most people live their lives and how they conceive of their future in Asia.
Indeed. Well, I hope you found this of some interest. We'll be having a fuller discussion this evening with a wide audience. Pankaj can be caught on the pages of the New York Review of Books, the London Review, the New York Times every now and then, but above all in his books. And I'm certainly looking forward to the next one, just as I loved rereading ahead of your visit this one, because I rediscovered characters that I had come to care about in reading the book. And when you wish them a sort of fond farewell often in the book, you're dying to know what happened next. And of course, you have to go and read other books to find out what happened next. But this was a superb and absolutely panoramic effort to capture something that very few people in the West know about, a period of history in a region of the world that to most of us, like me, born in Canada, although I lived in many of these countries, in Iran and Syria and Egypt, India and so on, and I'm now living in Japan, there's so much history that we don't know that when we have an opportunity to learn something about it, it's genuinely exciting, especially when it's written as well as you write.
Thank you very much, David. You're very kind.